Khan Shalom, all praise to Yahawah Bashim Yashai Bashim Kakadash, double honors to the apostles and elders of Greatmillstone, and salutations to the hopeful electors pushing his truth and sincerity. So this rabbi is actually going to explain about who the Edomites are, concerning his ancestries. So let me just play this, man.
Unquote. Moreover, our tradition tells us that the Edomites are the ancestors of the Romans, and indeed of all Europeans and the entire Christian world, are the ancestors of the Romans, and indeed of all Europeans and the entire Christian world. The Midrash says, quote, that the Edomites are the ancestors of the Romans, and indeed of all Europeans and the entire Christian world. Tradition tells us that the Edomites are the ancestors of the Romans, and indeed of all Europeans and the entire Christian world.
Boom. And while he's saying this, he doesn't seem to understand that, apparently he doesn't seem to understand that the bloodline of the Edomites goes back to those who are right now ruling in Israel, the Holy Land of our people, because to the Balfour Declaration, you had Europeans moving to our Holy Land. And those are the Amalekites, the Zionists, those who converted to the religion called Judaism, living in our Holy Land today. They are not Israelites. They are not descendants of Jacob. They are the descendants of Esau, Edom. So let me get this scripture, man. The book of Psalms, chapter 64, verse 8. So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away. The thing in this time is called self-snitching. He did some self-snitching without even understanding that he did some self-snitching. And that is if his bloodline goes back to being an Edomite. Because you also have Israelites who may look like Edomites in the Holy Land today. The book of Luke, chapter 8, verse 17. For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be made known and come abroad. Everything that Esau did in the dark is being made bare. The whole confusion, the tricking, the deceit upon this earth, the blinding of the people. The Heavenly Father is revealing, or should I say, unveiling everything upon this earth, man. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 25, verse 7. And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all the nations, which took place by Esau, Edom. The covering cherub that blinded all the people with his deception, with his witchcraft, with rewriting, history, his story. Esau has tricked a lot of people upon this earth in believing in humongous and atrocious lies, man. But now to the spirit and power of the Most High, truth is prevailing, and it's spreading all over the earth, man. People waking up to the fact who they are. For the ones who want to say like the Edomites have been exterminated, in which timeline were they exterminated? If they ruled in Rome, and now we're living in a continuation, to the, the Treaty of Rome. Let's get that. So they say it in English. Oh, here it was in Dutch. Here it is in English. Let's just read it from here. What did the Treaty of Rome do? The Treaty of Rome aimed to create a common market for the movement of goods, services, people, and capital, led to the creation of Custom Union, which was completed in 1968, a common trade policy and common agriculture policy, the European Court of Justice and the European Commission, among other things. You see? So we're living in a continuation of the Roman Empire, which is being ruled and was ruled by who? By the Edomites. So who is ruling in this empire? Edomites. Edomites are ruling until the appointed time where they will be defeated and destroyed by the Heavenly Father. So the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let me see where it is. Verse 7. For the mystery of iniquity, it was a mystery who the Edomites were. To us it is not a mystery. We know who they are. You know, and an Edomite doesn't want to come out by saying that they're Edomites because they read in the Bible what is going to happen with an Edomite. Nobody wants to be an Edomite. You know, an Edomite reading about it be like, man, hey, we better say that they are exterminated. You know, or they want to come up with loopholes and say things like the Lord also died for the Edomites. But the Lord didn't die for Edomites. The Lord the Redeemer didn't die for the heathens. He only died for his chosen people. And those are the Israelites. It says, for the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. That is, Esau is ruling upon this earth by the will of the Most High until the time appointed where they're going to be taken out of power. You know, and even till the point after they serve their sentence for what they have done unto their twin brother Jacob. After that they will be exterminated. You know, and that's all according to what is written in the Bible. And then shall that wicked, which is Esau, you know, like even the rabbi said, the epitome of wickedness mentioned even in their scriptures, man. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, which is taking place by the words coming out of the mouth of the prophets, because the prophets are the mouthpiece of the Most High, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming the Lord the Redeemer, Yahawashi, he that delivers, coming back in the chariots, which are the spaceships, you know, in gloriousness amongst with the angels, you know, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. Yeah, which is Esau, because Esau goes back to the Satan, the serpent in the garden. You know, it goes back to Cain. It's the same spirit working upon this earth, being a murderer, being deceitful, being the adversary. It says, and with all deceivableness and unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause the Most High shall send them strong delusions, that they should believe a lie, and that they all might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. You see, and that's why these fellas right now rule upon this earth, and they're being deceived, tricked by enticing and enchantment and summoning up in divination, asking guidance from Satan to do what they do in order to receive the New World Order. You know, the totalitarian state upon this earth. That's what they're aiming after, their enterprise, but they're not going to achieve it, because it is simply not the will of the Most High that these devils will get the enterprise. So going on. So yeah, man, the nation of Edom, Genesis 36 verse 1. Now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. So when you go to where is it? Here in 8 you also see it. Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. But when you go to the verse 12, and Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bare to Eliphaz Amalek. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. When we speak about Amalek, Amalek is the head tribe, you know, the elite tribe, so to say, you know, the left-handed elect, so to say, of the nation of Edom, you know, and those are the types that are right now in rulership. You got Edomites in their own empire being broke, you know, dusty, trailer park trash, you know, in a lower state, catching hell by the works of their own people. But the elites are ruling right now upon the earth. The elites, the elect of the left-hand side, the elect of the nation of Edom, which are the Amalekites, they are ruling upon this earth today. But it's the whole nation of Edom that is actually given a space and time and license to do and to be who they are. You know, until the time is there to receive the recompense according to their actions and their words upon this earth, man. You know, so hey, this is another one to show you that these Edomites do know who they are. Till a certain degree, they know who the Edomites are, but you got a lot of these Israelis who might even think and believe that they that they are not Edomites. They most definitely believe that they are Jacob descendants, man. But let me just show you quickly the Balfour Declaration. Balfour. So, boom. Let me see, man. Let me just read it from here. Going quick. Oh, here we got it. It says, Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government, a few with a favor of establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish, and these are not Israelites, these are converted people onto the religion, to the religion Judaism, which is a man-made religion based on one of the 12 tribes, or should I say the head tribe of the 12 tribes, which is Judah, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. So, they appointed the land into their own hands. Hey, you got these, man. The faces involved, important faces. Or should I say important as in wickedness which has been wrought upon this earth, The author of the declaration, Lionel Walter Rothschild. Rothschild was the figurehead of the British Jewish community and is the man to whom the declaration was addressed. Here you have Chaim Weizmann, a Russian Zionist and later the first president of Israel. Weizmann's contribution to the British war effort was a scientist, made him well connected to the upper echelons of the British government. He played a central role in lobbying for the government to issue the declaration. And here you have David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister in the coalition government between 1916 and 1922. Lloyd George's government issued the Balfour Declaration. It says he created the War Cabinet to make major strategic decisions during World War I and ensured that the Zionist project was on the agenda. And do understand, I actually don't even have to say it, but these are all Edomites. For the ones who might question, these are Edomites. It says Mark Sykes, serving in the British government's war cabinet, Sykes acted as a key channel between British Zionists and politicians. He was highly involved in the negotiations that led to the declaration and convincing the other Allied powers to support it. Here we got Herbert Samuel, said to be the first Jewish cabinet minister in England in 1909. Samuel, an ardent Zionist, introduced the idea of a Jewish state to the British government as early as 1914. He worked closely with Chaim Weizmann and advised him on how to further Zionist aims in government circles. And who is this? Nahum Sokolow, if I'm pronouncing it right, was a Polish, you see, and they came, where they came from, Europe. Polish writer and diplomat Nahum Sokolow traveled widely to rally support from world powers to back the declaration. Most notably, he met with high-profile French officials in May 1917 and managed to convince them that Palestine should come under British control. Very clear. So, this is actually the first time that I clicked on this site, and there are a lot of things, man. There are a lot of things on this website, man. 100 years on, the Balfour Declaration explained. Let's see. Got a quick clip. I'ma play it. Lord willing, it's not gonna be removed by YouTube, because you know how they get down. But I know it's from Al Jazeera, so Yahawah, so let me just play this. Oh, it's 48 minutes. Whoa. This is not just a clip.
The voice of David Ben-Gurion declaring the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948. The Balfour Declaration was a letter sent by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to a member of the British House of Lords, Lord Rothschild, on the 2nd of November 1917. This letter, sent to a leading figure in the British Jewish community 100 years ago, had repercussions which even its authors cannot have imagined. Whatever its real intentions, it went on to have a profound impact on the Middle East and its people. And its effects still resonate across the region today. In 1914, these soldiers were fighting on the battlefields of Europe in the First World War. The Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, fought the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire for 4 years. But the Land and Sea War was not the only battleground. Muscle was also being flexed behind closed doors, as allies conspired how to redraw maps to their own advantage when the conflict eventually ceased. Sir Mark Sykes for the British and François-Georges Picot for the French plotted how to divide the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire, assuming it would finally fall. The Sykes-Picot Agreement planned secretly to divide it into French and British spheres of influence, France taking most of the Levant, southern Anatolia and the Mosul area, while the British extended their control over the southern Levant, expanding eastwards to Baghdad and Basra, and all the land between the Arabian Gulf and the French territory. Historic Palestine, then still part of the Ottoman Empire, was a bone of contention and would be put under international administration.
La Palestine, Français, Anglais et Russes n'arrivent pas à s'accorder parce que tout le monde veut avoir la Palestine. Pourquoi? Parce que, d'une part, la Palestine, la France a de très riches souvenirs en Palestine, et l'Angleterre, elle, C'est surtout la position de la Palestine qui l'intéresse, parce que la Palestine est relativement proche du canal de Suez. Le canal de Suez, c'est la voie qui mène à l'Empire des Indes. On décide de créer un régime international, d'internationaliser la Palestine.
عندما وزعت نسخ الاتفاقية على المسؤولين البريطانيين الكبار وجدت معارضة وأثيرت حولها تحفظات كبيرة ولكن لم يكن هناك رغبة للتراجع.
I think the British felt that there had not been enough government involvement in concluding the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French. And in that process, they had not really protected their interests well enough for a post-World War era in which the British Empire would continue to seek to be a dominant force in European affairs. And so, really, officials across Whitehall, including Mark Sykes himself, felt it was a bad deal.
في أثناء هذا الجدل أعتقد أثيرت مسألة أنه في هناك حركة صهيونية وأنه في هناك جزء من اليهود يطمحون بالعودة إلى فلسطين وأن يكون لهم يعني وجود في فلسطين وكيان في فلسطين. وأنا أعتقد أن هذا المناخ هو الذي أطلق العملية التي أدت إلى إعلان بلفور.
And it's of huge significance that when they're making these discussions, Jews and Zionism are not discussed. Jews were not to feature in the new cartography of the Middle East, which was to be based on the idea of the Arab nation.
Zionism was the movement supporting the re-establishment of a Jewish homeland in the area it defined as the historic land of Israel. The movement was active in early 20th century London, especially because of the persecution of Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe. Theodor Herzl had founded the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, but Jewish people in Western Europe had not rushed to support it because they were integrating quite successfully into society.
Zionists believed that all Jews should someday return to that country. One of the problems was that Palestine belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was not clear that it wanted massive Jewish immigration into Palestine. And the British government offered to let Jews move unimpeded in great numbers into Uganda if they wished. But in any event, it really didn't happen. And it didn't happen because a majority of Zionists felt that Herzl was selling them out, and that the only place for Jews to move back to, or at least conscious Zionist Jews to move back to, was Palestine.
In this, I think, Britain began to look on the Zionist movement as a possible partner in justifying a renegotiations of their agreement with the French. You see, for Britain simply to claim territory against what they'd already concluded in an agreement with France could create diplomatic problems for the British. But if they were to make a claim to Palestine, not out of self-interest, but in order to advance a great historic ideal of the restoration of the Jewish people to their biblical homeland, that this could justify an adjustment of the terms of Sykes-Picot in a way that the French would accept.
The British wanted somehow, and more increasingly, they felt that the Jews held the key to winning the war. And so they had to figure out how to bribe the Jews to support them.
Sir Mark Sykes had succeeded in drawing the line he wanted from Acre in the west to Kirkuk in the east. But for some in government, this was not enough.
The British were using the Jewish national movement to secure Palestine for themselves. This is when Chaim Weizmann is really going to find open ears on 10 Downing Street, in the Foreign Office, in the Colonial Office. And it's paving the way towards that critical decision in November of 1917. And so I think you can draw a direct connection between Britain's sudden acknowledgement of Zionism as an idea and an ideal, and what they were dissatisfied with in the terms of Sykes-Picot.
Chaim Weizmann was a chemistry lecturer in Manchester who had become a prominent member of the British Zionist movement. He was politically well connected and rubbed shoulders with senior figures in government.
So Chaim Weizmann was Russian by birth. He was a chemist, and then he joined the Zionist movement. He climbed in the Zionist movement. He moved to Great Britain before the war, well before the war, maybe 10 years before the war began. He was not, before the war, very well known in the English Zionist movement. He was pretty well known in the World Zionist Federation, but he was by no means the most visible Zionist when World War I began in Great Britain.
Weizmann later wrote in his memoirs about having been introduced to a British government minister, Herbert Samuel. Samuel was Jewish, but Weizmann was apparently concerned that he might be anti-Zionist. However, Herbert Samuel turned out to be extremely receptive to Weizmann and went on to write an official memo in 1915, setting out a number of different possibilities for Palestine and the Jewish people.
كان وزير الصحة health minister هيك شيء يعني. فهو كان ما له علاقة يعني مفروض انه ما له علاقة بالسياسة، بس هو كتب مذكرة عن فلسطين لما لقى انه الظروف اللي طلعتها الحرب العالمية الأولى، لقى حاله انه هو أول يهودي ذو يعني مركز موجود بالحكومة البريطانية. كتب مذكرة للحكومة إنه شو بده يصير بفلسطين بعد ما تنتهي الحرب، وحط عدة احتمالات. إحدى الاحتمالات إنها تصير دولة يهودية أو تصير تحت الحماية البريطانية فلسطين، أو تصير بطل يسميها دولة يهودية الكومنولث يعني كيان.
But he didn't find willing ears in Whitehall or in the colonial office for schemes that involved the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Britain was really concerned with two things by the time that the First World War had broken out. They wanted to win the war, first and foremost. This was an imperative for the survival of Britain and its empire. And secondly, they wanted to ensure that coming out of the war victorious, that their empire would benefit from the victory.
So at this stage, Chaim Weizmann's and Herbert Samuel's ideas about the rights of the Jews to resettle in Palestine did not find much sympathy in the corridors of power in London. A disappointed Weizmann wrote to a friend asking whether there wasn't at least a discussion to be had about what he called the chance for the Jewish people. I realize, of course, he went on, we cannot claim anything. We are much too atomized for it. What the debate did do, however, was to throw together Weizmann, the Russian Jewish immigrant searching for a homeland and refuge from persecution, with Herbert Samuel and Lord Rothschild, firm members of the British Jewish elite, established in society and part of the political and capitalist class.
Zionism, for the most part, across all of the community, was actually in the minority, but certainly most of all within the Jewish elite, because it threatened the notion of them as 100% committed members of British society. And this was complete anathema for somebody like Edwin Montagu, who becomes Secretary of State for India. For him, Zionism is his worst nightmare. The idea that Jews are not satisfied simply with being citizens of Britain or other countries around the world, but are always longing to go back to the land of Israel. For him, he wanted to demonstrate that the Jews of Britain were first and foremost British.
It's important to remember that for people like Rothschild, Zionism had actually been a threat. You see, the elite in British Jewry had fought for generations to gain acceptance in British society. It was only with the arrival of Disraeli in the 19th century that Jews entered Parliament and could rise to become Prime Minister. And for people of high finance or banking interests, the real elite of the Jewish community in Britain, their struggle to demonstrate their place in British society meant that Zionism, with its claims that Jews were a people apart and should be a nationalist movement in their own right, were anathema.
وبالتالي لا ينبغي يعني تقدير الحركة الصهيونية في ذلك الوقت باعتبارها حركة كل يهود أوروبا الغربية، وأن هي كانت تلقى دعم من كافة أو من أغلبية يهودية في أوروبا الغربية. هذا من جهة. من جهة أخرى يعني الأدلة تشير إلى أنه المسؤولين البريطانيين في المرحلة بعد ربيع 1916 هم الذين سعوا للحديث مع مسؤولي الحركة الصهيونية وليس العكس.
ויצמן הבין שמה שחשוב זה להבין לא מה האינטרס הציוני, אלא מה האינטרס הבריטי. כי דרך האינטרס הבריטי הוא יוכל לקדם את העניין הציוני. כלומר, ויצמן לא השלה את עצמו, הוא לא חיפש אינטרסים משותפים.
It's Weizmann that makes the difference, and I think he was probably unique in his ability to persuade leading British figures that the Jews were, in fact, a vast subterranean influence, which they were not, that all Jews were Zionists, which was far from the truth, and that therefore the key to winning Jewish support was to offer them Palestine.
Weizmann talked up the degree to which the Jewish community supported Zionism in order to get his message across to the government. But for the British, it seemed to be about self-interest, about winning the war. Recognizing Zionism would be closely linked to gaining global Jewish support for this objective on which it saw its future resting.
So the British motives for supporting Zionism, really we can boil it down to two elements of British self-interest at that time. Not an emotional interest in Zionism or a love of Jews and the Jewish plight and a desire for a return of the Jews to the Holy Land. No, for very specific self-interest matters of policy. They were, first of all of the British government agreed that they wanted to mobilize behind Britain and the Allies this idea of Jewish power in the world. They were, like all of the different policy elites in the war, believers in the notion that Jews were of tremendous influence in the corridors of power around the globe. If the British government appeared to support Zionism, they would win over world Jewry to their side and all that that entailed. The British were convinced that Zionism was really at the center of the Jewish heart.
In May 1916, Sir Mark Sykes had agreed his secret deal with the French. Sykes-Picot would form the basis of the future carve-up of the old Ottoman Empire. So he immediately turned his attention to Palestine, still part of the Ottoman Empire, and how to use Zionist ambitions to outmaneuver the French. Formal contact between the British government and the Zionists followed.
He immediately phoned Herbert Samuel and told him about the plan. And Herbert Samuel then phoned Chaim Weizmann, and Weizmann brought with him Nahum Sokolow. This meeting took place on the 11th of April 1916. It took place at Moses Gaster's house in Maida Vale. And Gaster wrote in his diary afterwards how proud he was that this meeting, which he thought was the most important meeting that had ever taken place in the history of Zionism, had taken place at his house.
أول ما مارك سايكس يعني تعرف على الحركة الصهيونية، أول شيء اتصلوا مع جاستر لأنه هو كان الممثل تبع الجالية اليهودية، بس بعدين راح دوره ووايزمان هو اللي يعني استطاع النور تبعه وهو اللي سيطر على كل الموضوع.
And Moses Gaster very quickly understands that Sykes is looking to gain support from supposed Jewish power in the world, and Gaster works with this idea and manipulates this to consolidate Sykes' interest in Zionism. And we see actually the British government becomes very close already in 1916 of issuing a public declaration in support for Zionism. Now, in the end, this doesn't happen that year.
The plan Sykes got Herbert Samuel to pass on to the Zionist leaders involved joint British-French administration of Palestine and a charter guaranteeing British support for Zionism. But his idea was rejected.
They didn't want an Anglo-French condominium in Palestine. They wanted the British to protect them, not the French, and that's because they thought that the French always sort of converted their colonized people into becoming Frenchmen. And what they wanted was to remain as self-conscious Jews, and they thought that the British would leave them alone and let them do that.
אני חושב שמה שהרצל הבין וגם ויצמן וסוקולוב ורבים אחרים זה שהבריטים אולי מציעים הצעה שהיא לא כל כך טובה, אבל הם מוכנים לדבר עם התנועה הציונית כנציגת העם היהודי. צריך לזכור שהתנועה הציונית הייתה מיעוט קטן בתוך העם היהודי. רוב היהודים לא היו ציונים. והנה באה המעצמה, אולי המעצמה החשובה ביותר בעולם, אומרת, הנה אתם, הפנים הרשמיות של היהודים, מוכנים לסגור איתכם עסק.
Bolstered by their newfound credibility, the British Zionists thought about making specific demands after the Sykes meeting, but events soon overtook them. On the 6th of December 1916, British Prime Minister Asquith resigned. In the change of government, Arthur Balfour became Foreign Secretary under Prime Minister David Lloyd George.
Lloyd George سياسي بارز في حزب الأحرار في ذلك الوقت، ثم أصبح رئيسا للوزراء منذ ديسمبر 1916. يقال أنه تلقى يعني تربية وتعليما مسيحيا بروتستانتيا، وأنه ربما يعني هذا قد ساعد في تقبله لفكرة الوجود اليهودي في فلسطين.
Balfour was of rather philosophical bent, and I think he wanted to think in theological terms, he wanted to think in historical terms, and it was with that frame of mind, I think, that he approached the whole question.
سياسة التفاوض مع الصهاينة ومحاولة البحث عن مخرج من اتفاقية سايكس بيكو، هذه السياسة واصلتها حكومة لويد جورج يعني تماما كما بدأتها حكومة أسكوث. وبلفور بصفته وزير الخارجية كان أصبح يعني جزء مهم من هذه العملية.
David Lloyd George, A.J. Balfour, and all of those who supported the Balfour Declaration within the British government, we can absolutely categorize as being riven with anti-Semitic thinking. And not only that, but the thinking behind the Balfour Declaration that drove them to the Balfour Declaration was from this anti-Semitic thought. The idea of Jewish power, of Jewish cohesiveness, and of a unified Jewish attachment to Zionism above all else.
Whatever its basis, the relationship between the British Zionists and the government would continue to grow throughout 1917, leading to the declaration that would change the face of the Middle East and ultimately determine the destinies of two different peoples. The First World War pitted Britain, France, and Russia against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The British, in the shape of the diplomat Sir Mark Sykes, were determined to divide Ottoman territory in a way that best suited them once the war was over, for their own strategic interests. By 1917, the war was shifting in the Allies' favor, and in the Middle East, the British were moving through Sinai towards the borders of historic Palestine. Further north, the Russian Revolution in February 1917 cast doubt on Russia's continued involvement in the war. As Britain and France tried to outmaneuver one another, the British Zionist movement took on increasing political importance.
Sykes wants to get back in touch with Zionists and think about how to incorporate Zionism in British planning for Palestine. And at this moment we see a hugely important meeting taking place in the home of Moses Gaster in Maida Vale in February of 1917. And this is the point in which Sykes meets for the first time Chaim Weizmann and Nachum Sokolov and other Zionists, in which it's discussed what the Zionists are looking for and the British interest in Zionism.
So he had to bring the Zionists along without divulging what were the secret agreements that Britain and France had come to with regard to Palestine, which was that they would jointly administer parts of Palestine. At this meeting for the British government was Sykes and Herbert Samuel, who was there. On the other side, there were Weizmann and Sokolov, and there was Moses Gaster, and he brought a couple of his allies because he realized that Weizmann was beginning to push him out of the way. The other very important figure was James Rothschild, who attended this meeting. At the meeting, it became clear to Sykes that Weizmann, not Gaster, was the most important Zionist.
This is also the moment where Moses Gaster is dislodged. Sykes' partner on the French side, Picot, hadn't liked Gaster. Gaster had been insistent that there should be a Jewish state and nothing less coming into being after the war. And Picot clearly wanted Zionists who were much more willing to compromise with the interests of the great powers. And Nachum Sokolov and Chaim Weizmann were certainly happy to fit that bill.
The meetings between the Zionists and the government seemed to give momentum to the idea of British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine and their potential role in its administration. But the secret Sykes-Picot agreement between Britain and France, which formed the basis of the future division of the Ottoman Empire, planned to put Palestine under international administration. Any change would have to be negotiated with France. Naim Sokolov emerged as the man to talk to the French.
נחום סוקולוב היה דוקטור בהיסטוריה, יהודי שמקורו ברוסיה, שהיגר מערבה והתיישב בבריטניה.
Sokolov became the acknowledged lead diplomat for Zionism. And all the accounts say that he had an extremely sort of elegant bearing and wore very fine clothing, and that his manners were polished and polite and smooth, silky smooth, so that he could talk on an equal basis with the representatives of the Germans, Kaiser, or the British government, or whatever. So the day after the meeting between Sykes and the Zionist leaders, Sykes brought Sokolov to meet the French diplomat Picot. What Sykes wanted was for Sokolov to persuade Picot that Zionism must be taken seriously, that Zionism really was the key to winning the war, and that the Zionists would only help the Allies win the war if Britain was the main power in Palestine, not France.
François-Georges Picot rédige une petite note qu'il remet officiellement à Sokolov que la France encourage ou encouragera. Elle est tout à fait d'accord avec la colonisation juive qui vous tient tant à cœur en Palestine. Et non seulement ça, mais en plus, les gens du Quai d'Orsay conseillent à Sokolov d'aller à Rome pour s'entendre avec le gouvernement italien.
بتحريض من سايكس نفسه انه سوكولوف يروح ورتب له يعني انه يروح على فرنسا ويعملوا هذا الشيء كان خصوصي معمول علشان البريتش كابينت وبتعرف انه التصريح الفرنساوي طلع قبل وعد بلفور علشان بالكابينت الانجليزيه يقولوا انه اوريدي الفرنساويين طلعوا تصريح.
It's hard to know how much influence Sykes ultimately had over British policymaking. He was given more prominence in British policymaking around the Middle East during the war years than he ever deserved. He was a relatively ill-educated, inexperienced man whose only connection to the Ottoman world had been as a tourist. So for this man to be playing such a role in the halls of power over deciding British policy towards the Near East seems to us today to be anomalous, indeed ridiculous.
Regardless of Sykes' role, things continued to progress for the Zionists, and in June 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour asked Chaim Weizmann to present his demands as a declaration and promised to try and persuade his government to adopt it. The leading Zionists formed a political committee and drafted their demands, and then submitted them to the British government. This original document was one of the first drafts written at the Imperial Hotel in London on the 17th of July, 1917. It also introduced a new term and concept, the national home of the Jewish people.
So in the initial Zionist drafting of the declaration, there were protests amongst Zionist leaders to Nachum Sokolov that there's no mention of the terminology of a Jewish state, that instead they're talking about a national home. And so that this is a betrayal of what the Zionists are trying to achieve. And Sokolov's response was that we mustn't go too far. We have to take small steps. We have to go with what is acceptable to the British government at this time. And then slowly, we can advance our cause once we have this in hand.
بالإضافة إلى أنه المصطلح نفسه مصطلح وطن قومي، يعني هذا ليس مصطلح، يعني في ذلك الوقت كان القانون الدولي يعني قد نضج إلى حد كبير، وكان يمكن أن تستخدم كلمة حكم ذاتي، يمكن أن تستخدم كلمة دولة مستقلة، وليس في القانون الدولي في مصطلح اسمه وطن قومي. يعني ما الذي يعنيه وطن قومي لليهود في فلسطين؟
On the 18th of September 1917, there was a meeting of the British War Cabinet, though Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour was absent. The Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, who was Jewish, strongly disagreed with the declaration. He was opposed to Zionism and said, "I deny that Palestine is today associated with the Jews, or properly be regarded as a fit place for them to live." Montagu thought a French declaration supporting Zionism in June 1917 was anti-Semitic and negotiated changes to the British version as it went through several drafts.
الصيغة تبعت الوعد كان لازم تاخذ بالاعتبار الاعتراضات اللي وضعتها القيادات اليهودية الإنجليزية المعارضة للصهيونية، اللي هي بتقول إنه على شرط عدم المساس بالحقوق السياسية لليهود المقيمين في الدول يعني الغربية.
ולכן אגב, כשאתה קורא את הצהרת בלפור, זה לא נכון שלגמרי לא הקשיבו למונטגיו, הקשיבו לו. הוסיפו להצהרת בלפור סעיף שאומר שגם הזכויות האזרחיות המשפטיות של הלא יהודים כאן בארץ לא תיפגענה, אבל גם הזכויות של היהודים בארצותיהם לא תיפגענה. זו תוספת מאוד חשובה, וזה מונטגיו.
A few days later, Secretary of State for War Viscount Milner, and the Jewish politician Philip Magnus sent a modified version to the cabinet. It incorporated some of Montagu's changes, including the caveat that, quote, "Nothing shall be done that might prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by such Jews who are fully contented with their existing nationality and citizenship."
Drafting, especially by Lord Milner, that appeared by September, was closer to the language that would eventually be adopted in November of 1917, namely speaking not about Palestine as a whole, but some sort of presence in Palestine on behalf of the Jews, which is quite different.
كانت كل كلمة بوعد بلفور إلها معنى. فالفرق إنك تقول the national home يعني التعريف الوطن القومي، غير عن إنك تقول a national home. وهم يعني تناقشوا فيها قبل ما يصدروا الوعد، تناقشوا فيها وقالوا إحنا ما عم نقول بدنا نعطي the national home، إحنا بدنا نعطي a national home، يعني وطن قومي يهودي في فلسطين.
The committed Zionists wanted to ensure the declaration was clear that the whole of historic Palestine would be a national homeland exclusively for the Jewish people. The latest draft was sent to Chaim Weizmann, who in turn sent it to the Zionist movement in the United States for their feedback.
There was some consultation during the summer of 1917 with the United States, and the early drafts that had the imprint of the Zionist elements in Britain would have referred to Palestine in its entirety as being for some sort of Jewish entity, and those elements eventually were modified before the drafting was finalized.
Another key part of the terminology that emerged in part of the drafting was in some British redrafting, where instead of for the Jewish people, it was written the Jewish race. Now eventually this was taken out, but I think it's very revealing that British officials wanted to use this kind of terminology, because after all, this was how they understood the Jews of the world, as being a racial group, one that wielded tremendous power and also could be inspired altogether as one unit behind the cause of Zionism supported by Britain and the Allies.
It's striking that the existing Arab people in the region were not named at all. They're simply called the, quote, existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Les Juifs vont être qualifiés de peuple, c'est-à-dire que vous avez le droit des peuples à disposer d'eux-mêmes, tandis que les Arabes, ce sont des communautés non juives. On ne cite même pas le nom des Arabes, ce sont des non-juifs, qui n'ont que des droits civils et religieux. Ils n'ont pas de droit politique, aucun droit politique.
By October 1917, the final draft of the Balfour Declaration was ready, awaiting only British government final approval. There was a rumor that Germany was about to issue a similar declaration supporting the rights of the Jews in Palestine. When Balfour heard, he rushed to get his final draft discussed at the cabinet meeting on the 31st of October 1917.
So when we think about the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, everyone considers 2nd of November 1917 as the moment of the declaration itself. But it was actually agreed to by the British cabinet on the 31st of October. And this was a hugely significant meeting. And in the minutes of that meeting, Balfour reiterates the principal reasons for supporting Zionism and highlights its expected propaganda effects amongst Jews around the world, particularly in the United States and in Russia.
The argument was put forward most strongly by Lord Balfour at the meeting of October 31st. And what he argued was that issuing this declaration would be extremely helpful for the British in solidifying the support of the United States and also in countering propaganda from Germany.
The critical thing to remember about British diplomatic pronouncements is that what one individual says does not represent the views of the government as a whole. And you will find many different points of view among British officials in the years 1917, 1918, right into the early years of the Mandate. But the British were very clear that they had not promised statehood to the Zionist movement. They had no interest in doing so. The British did not support Jewish nationalism. They did not support Arab nationalism. They supported British imperialism.
But this is also the meeting where Lord Curzon, who was a member of the War Cabinet, disquiet about the possible effects of supporting Zionism on the Palestinian Arab population and the Palestinian opposition is completely disregarded.
Lord Curzon wrote a paper to the cabinet asking what was, quote, to become of the people of this country.
There were over 500,000 Syrian Arabs, a mixed community with Arab, Hebrew, Canaanite, Greek, Egyptian and possibly Crusaders' blood. They and their forefathers have occupied the country for the best part of 1,500 years. They own the soil. They profess the Mohammedan faith. They will not be content either to be expropriated for Jewish immigrants or to act merely as hewers of wood and drawers of water to the latter.
But his prescient remarks fell on deaf ears.
It's Sykes who tells Chaim Weizmann at the end of the War Cabinet's meeting, Dr. Weizmann, it's a boy, as though they've witnessed the birth of an agreement to create a Jewish national home as a baby in the Middle East.
The final draft of the Balfour Declaration was 67 words long.
His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour.
Well, in terms of international law, it really has very little standing. In international law, treaties between nations have significance, but governments often issue policy statements, statements of intention about what they plan to do, and those really don't have any standing as a matter of law. For Britain, this was, I suppose you would say, a statement of its intention as to what it would do if it were to take over Palestine, which of course it had not yet done as of November 1917.
אז קודם כל לא הייתה הכרזה, כי לא הייתה הצהרה. היה מכתב שהנוסח שלו סוכם בממשלת בריטניה, לשכת שר החוץ הדפיסה אותו, וכעבור יומיים שלושה שר החוץ חתם עליו ושלח אותו לאחד רוטשילד שהיה אפילו לא היה ציוני.
2 years after the declaration, a church leader in Jerusalem wrote to British Prime Minister Lloyd George about Jews in Palestine trying to control holy sites. Lloyd George's office had said that Chaim Weizmann didn't want to do anything affecting the rights of Arabs. It said he simply wanted to be involved in a council to help provide refuge to Jews fleeing Russia and Eastern Europe. This exchange suggested that Britain felt it had not promised a Jewish state, but simply a place for them to live alongside Arabs. When the League of Nations set out the British mandate in Palestine in 1923, it made Britain responsible for implementing the Balfour Declaration. As a result, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, as did Arab opposition to it, expressed in a series of Palestinian protests against Britain in the 1920s.
They understood the people of Palestine to be Muslims and Christians, but did not imagine that they would constitute a national community that would seek national independence.
And after the war, very quickly when it becomes clear that Palestinian Arab nationalists are mobilizing against Zionism, the British government are quick to see a major problem.
The Balfour Declaration had put in train a series of events that began to signal its deep flaws. Arab dissent built to the 3-year revolt between 1936 and 1939. It was a nationalist uprising against the British administration, demanding Arab independence and the end of Jewish immigration.
It was in the Peel Commission of 1937 that the British first recognized that instead of balancing communities, they had set in motion a rivalry between incompatible national movements, Jewish and Palestinian Arab. And it was at that point that they tried to solve the problem by dividing Palestine into 2 states, Arab and Jewish, through a partition plan. And I think there you have the first recognition or admission from British officials of the failure of the Balfour Declaration.
In May 1939, the British government published a policy document on Palestine called a White Paper. It abandoned the partitioning of Palestine into 2 states and called instead for an independent Palestine in which Arabs and Jews would share government. It limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 for 5 years and said that the Arab majority should determine future immigration levels. It also said that Balfour had not meant to create a Jewish state at the expense of the Arabs, any more than the McMahon-Hussein correspondence 24 years before had promised an Arab state to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. But the White Paper met opposition and was dropped.
The British government are quick to see a major problem, but there's no way that they can back away from support for Zionism because this becomes the basis for their justification for being in the Holy Land, their commitment to supporting the movement in the Balfour Declaration, which becomes enshrined in international law in the terms of the Mandate for Palestine. So the British are stuck with Zionism. They didn't believe that Zionists wanted independent Jewish statehood. And after the war, it became very clear that actually the vast majority of Zionists didn't only want statehood, they expected it. I think if we're trying to assess whether or not Britain's policy towards Zionism in the First World War served British interests or not, the first thing we have to appreciate is the key reason that they supported Zionism was based on an incorrect idea. They believed that they could mobilize something that they saw as Jewish power around the world behind the Allied cause. So first of all, that was entirely wrong and didn't happen because this idea of Jewish power is fake, it's false.
In September 1939, German expansionism led to the Second World War. Over 60 million people died, including between 5 and 6 million Jews, the majority in Nazi concentration camps. The British Mandate ended at midnight on the 14th of May 1948, and immediately the formation of the State of Israel was announced, justified by the terms of the Balfour Declaration issued 31 years before. While Israelis celebrated the birth of their nation, 700,000 Palestinians were forced into camps and exile.
לכן, בלי בריטניה לא הייתה קמה מדינת ישראל, אין ויכוח. בלי הציונים זה לא היה קם, אבל גם בלי בריטניה, מדינת ישראל לא הייתה קמה.
For Palestinians, the Balfour Declaration represents the moment an imperial power promised their land away to another people.
This is the desk where the Balfour Declaration was composed. It is. That's where Balfour.
They hold Balfour responsible for their expulsion, displacement, and occupation.
Yeah, man. Shalom.